Jai Gopi Janna Vallabha Girivaradhari Yashodanandana Brajajana Ranjana Jamuna Tira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Vihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Krishna Balaram Krishna Balaram Krishna Balaram Jaya Krishna Balaram Jaya Gauda Nitai, Gauda Nitai, Gauda Nitai, Jaya Gauda Nitai. Lalita Vishaka Jaya Radhe Sham, Lalita Vishaka Jaya Radhe Sham. Prabhupada, 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 Jai, Jai, Prabhupada. Nitai Go Haribo, 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 Nitai Gaura Haribo. Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita Ke Om Jnanatimarandasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshurun Militam Jena Tasmai Shri Guruve Namaha. We're in chapter 5, but the previous chapter, How Shall I Serve You, was very, very enlightening. How Srila Prabhupada wanted again and again to see or have the darshan of Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur, hearing from him, also on various occasions meeting with Srila Prabhupada. Many of the senior disciples of Srila Bhakti Siddhanta wanted that Srila Prabhupada be involved in the Gaudiya Math because they said this Abhay Babu, he's very, it's good? Yeah, it's okay. He's very good, especially for Srila Bhakti Siddhanta's Saraswati's 62nd Vyasa Puja. Srila Prabhupada wrote a beautiful poem and also addressed the audience and how Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati is giving the message of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, Jari Dako Tare Kaho Krishna Upadesha, Maragai Guru Hoy Tare Desh. Because people were very caste conscious, very much Brahminically. If one is not born in a Brahmana family, he's not accepted. And there was a lot of opposition actually to the Gaudiya Math. Srila Bhakti Siddhanta's, he organized a big parikrama in Braj Mandal. So many people were attending, but local caste Brahmanas were saying that, oh, you're ruining the Hindu religion by giving Brahminical or sannyasa initiation to non-Brahmanically born persons. This is not acceptable. But because Srila Bhaktisiddhanta was Shringa Guru and extremely capable and learned to express the conclusion of the Shastras, he explained how Chaitanya Mahaprabhu wanted to give this Krishna Bhakti to everyone. So we even saw when Prabhupada came with Western disciples from around the world, people objected still that, how is it that you're giving this Brahminical initiation or sannyas initiation, this sanskara? This is not right, this is against our religion. But Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, Srila Prabhupada carrying the mission of his Guru Maharaj, being ordered that no need for him to come and join the math, because after Srila Bhaktisiddhanta passed away, although he made a committee of 12, like a GBC, Prabhupada made our GBC, so Srila Bhaktisiddhanta wanted that the Gaudiya Math be managed in that way, but very soon after Srila Bhaktisiddhanta passed away, the fighting began over property and, how you say, prestige, to be the leader. They wanted to have one person as the leader of the Gaudiya Math. So we're reading here the 5th chapter, but the last chapter was definitely very powerful chapter. I don't know if everyone remembers the last chapter. And sometimes when we're hearing about the activities of pure devotees, we might think in a mundane way. Oh, he had family, or he had business, he did this, he did that. And avajanati mang mudha manushing tanumashritam. Even Lord Krishna says that those who think that he's an ordinary personality, they're just blind and foolish. But Srila Prabhupada's coming to Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati was not just by chance, and his desire to fulfill the mission of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta, despite family and so many challenges, it does not in any way, put him on a mundane platform. Pure devotee is always above that section here. So we're in chapter 5, the war. I will read hopefully slowly. Under the circumstances, since 1936 up to now, I was simply speculating whether I should venture this difficult task, and that without any means and capacity. But as none have discouraged me, I have now taken courage to take up the work. So Srila Prabhupada wrote that in the Back to Godhead magazine, that now he wanted to further carry out the mission of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati of spreading the message of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu throughout the world. The fire in the math broke out almost immediately. A senior disciple said that there should be one acharya who would be the spiritual successor to Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, and who would perform all initiations and settle all controversies. But Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati had never said that. He had never called for one acharya. Rather, he had instructed the members of the Gaudiya Math to form a governing body of 12 men and carry on a concerted effort. But that instruction was abandoned, and the suggestion that there be one leader took hold. A single person, instead of 12, should take charge, and now it became a rush for who? We even see in our own society so many challenges and difficulties as we're trying to move forward in representing Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and the Goswamis and Srila Prabhupada's teachings in his books. Two parties contested. Ananta Vasudev, one of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta's leading preachers, was ambitious, and he pressed his claim with a group of influential sannyasi supporters. Another man, Kunja Bihari, shrewdly went after the properties. He had been a leading administrator under Srila Bhakti Siddhanta, and now he claimed ownership of the palatial temple in Calcutta, as well as all the other properties and assets of the India-wide Gaudiya Math. This is not too long ago, actually, just even within our lifetime, we're seeing so many developments. Although in his will, Srila Bhakti Siddhanta had expressed his desire that his disciples select the governing body, a governing board, to manage all properties and funds of the Gaudiya Math, Kunja Bihari contested the will's legitimacy. He and his supporters argued that since Srila Bhakti Siddhanta had received the properties on behalf of God, he was not their rightful owner and therefore could not determine their future ownership. Thus, he and the others disputed over the legal and theological aspects of the former Acharya's position. Shortly after Srila Bhakti Siddhanta's passing away, litigation had begun. Ananta Vasudeva, supported by a majority of the members of the Gaudiya Math, had claimed that he, as the next Acharya, was the owner and director of the properties. But although Kunja Bihari had only a few supporters, he defied the majority by pressing his claim through lawyers in court. Kunja Bihari and his men had possession of the Chaitanya Math and the temples in Mayapur. Vasudeva's party captured other buildings, quarreling, and fistfights broke out. The preaching of the Gaudiya Math stopped. Abhai's inability to take part in the activities of the Gaudiya Math was suddenly in his favor. He had always been more of a visitor than a member at the Math, and at least externally more the Grihastha businessman than a missionary worker. This automatically put him at a distance from the fray. Of course, he was associated with the Maths in Bombay and Allahabad, but he had no managerial position, no claims to ownership, and no role in the litigation. Nor did he desire to take sides in the struggle for power. Like many of the other disciples, he was mortified to see that his spiritual master's instructions for cooperation had been disregarded and his mission thrown into a legal dispute. Abhai knew that Srila Bhakti Siddhanta had wanted the leaders to work cooperatively, and so he could not sympathize with the warring factions. Both parties were an insult to Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati, but he wanted to preach. Although becoming a very good English preacher was something he was meditating on more than actively doing, the Gaudiya Math would logically have been the vehicle for his preaching. He had already contributed articles to the Gaudiya Math's publications and had been working with his godbrothers in Allahabad and Bombay centers. Naturally, he thought of serving his spiritual master in terms of serving within his spiritual master's mission. But the Gaudiya Math, which had always been known for pure, bold preaching of the message of Lord Chaitanya, was now becoming known for embroiled factions. As the Gaudiya Math broke down, he was also affected. Under the present circumstances, how could he carry out his spiritual master's order to preach? Previously, the main obstacle to his preaching had been family commitments, but now the obstacles were compounded. Now he had to wait helplessly for the outcome of this struggle. What would Krishna bring about? 1938. His Bombay business diminishing, Abai, now 42, moved back to Calcutta with his wife and family and rented a house at 6 Sita Kanta Banerjee Lane. The street was but a narrow lane, lined with either side with 3-story houses. His office was on the first floor, facing the street, and family lived upstairs. Matajis, if you want to talk, you should leave, okay? We're reading Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita now. So no butt shit, okay? Hare Krishna. He rented the adjoining building, number 7, and on the first floor operated a small chemical laboratory manufacturing distilled water. Days, pain liniment, Vimal tonic, Alpa, an injection for boils, and various other medicines. He also utilized a small outbuilding on the rear as part of his lab. Out front, he hung a large signboard, Abai Charan Day and Sons, displaying a picture of a mustached Abai Charan. So here we get the idea that, oh, Prabhupada is just an ordinary person. But he's showing by his personal, how a person from being absorbed in family life and or business can still, Yat karosh yadishnasya jahosya yat dadasya yat tapasyasi kauntya tad kurushmad arpanam. Whatever you're doing, he was doing it for the purpose of preaching Krishna consciousness. Sometimes he would employ 2 or 3 servants to assist him, but mostly he worked alone. And he would deliver his glass jugs of distilled water to agents such as Bengal Company and Gluconut. He printed a brochure advertising Day's Pain Liniment, good for relieving gout, rheumatism, and all pains. And if one wanted to be free of reoccurring diseases like rheumatism and gout, Abai's brochure directed them, in addition to using Day's Pain Liniment, one refrained from alcohol and all sorts of drinking or intoxicating habits. And food and drink should be very simple and innocent, such as vegetables and milk. The new Calcutta business enjoyed an early success, but Abai didn't have his heart in it. It was a duty. He had to do it to maintain his family. His new acquaintances in Calcutta found him to be a devotee of God at heart, a businessman, a family man, but more concerned with writing and preaching than with business and family. Chandi Mukherjee, a neighbor from nearby Bihari Street, he says he was interested only in devotional activities, and he did his business only to maintain the family. He didn't seem interested in the profit motive in accumulating money or becoming a rich man. Charan Mukherjee, Abai's next door neighbor. Abai Charan was always a very patient listener to every illogical argument that anybody, including myself, would bring to him. Not knowing philosophy, I would illogically present so many arguments, and Mr. Day would always very patiently listen. Nothing agitated him. He was always very calm and taught me about God. He would speak only of Krishna. He was translating the Gita and was maintaining his business. Neighbors would often see him sitting on his cot in the front room. He would read his spiritual master's books and sometimes recite the Sanskrit shlokas out loud. He liked to discuss philosophy with anyone who came by. His family keeping mostly upstairs, Abai would sit alone in the downstairs front room, dressed in dhoti and kurta, or sometimes a dhoti and only a vest. Often he would be at his writing, while outside the door his children played with the children of the Ganguly family and lived in the rear apartment of the same building. The neighbors lived openly in a kind of joint neighborhood family, and Abai talked freely with the other neighbors, but of Vaishnava philosophy, and only rarely of business. Mr. Ganguly found Abai's speech scholastic and always very philosophical. Abai was absorbed in the philosophy of Krishna consciousness, and even in brief conversations, he would refer to Lord Krishna and to Bhagavad Gita's description of Lord Krishna as the basis of both the material and spiritual worlds. While working in his laboratory or receiving a delivery of empty bottles from a Muslim bottle merchant, or going out to sell his medicine, he would be talking or thinking about God. In those days, for a person in Calcutta to be interested in God consciousness was not so unusual. Abai found even a man like Abdullah, the Muslim bottle merchant, to be very religious. One day Abai asked Abdullah, who had once been very poor but had become rich by his business, "Now you've got money, so how are you going to use your money?" The bottle merchant replied, "My dear sir, I have an intention to construct a mosque." Meanwhile, the war of the Gaudiya Math raged on. Both factions were ill-motivated, and both deviated from the instructions of their spiritual master. The very act of trying to determine ownership of the properties through legal action meant that the God brothers were disobeying the expressed desire of their spiritual master as stated in his will. The litigation continued year after year, but the legal wrangling could not bring them together or purify them. One court ruled in favor of Ananta Vasudev, but then a higher court awarded 2/3 of the Math's property to the Kunja Bihari and 1/3 to Vasudev. Still, although Vasudev had fewer properties, he inspired more followers. He seemed to them more intent on reviving the preaching of the Gaudiya Math. But when Vasudev subsequently fell down from the principles of sannyas by going off with a woman, the groups broke further to pieces. Most of the sannyasis continued to maintain their principles, but many now left the jurisdiction of the two contending factions in disgust. Individuals formed their own ashramas, Gaudiya Mission, Chaitanya Gaudiya Math, and others. The unified entity of Gaudiya Math as an all-India mission consisting of many temples, several presses, and hundreds of devotees working cooperatively under one leadership ceased to exist. God brothers continue to uphold the teachings of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu as they received them from Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. But because they were meant to work together, they lacked their former united potency. Illusions of proprietorship and prestige had superseded the spiritual master's order, and Srila Bhaktisiddhanta's cause, a worldwide movement for propagating Lord Chaitanya's teachings, collapsed. Wherever Abai went, he seemed to attract the company of his godbrothers. Some followers of Sridhar Maharaj, the same Sridhar with whom he had worked in Bombay and whom he had always regarded as a good devotee and scholar, met Abai at his place in Banerjee Lane and told this news to Sridhar Maharaj, that he was then living at his own ashram in Mayapur. Sridhar Maharaj had disaffiliated himself from the factions of the Gaudiya Math, but as a sannyasi, he was still preaching and interested in publishing Vaishnava literature. He had wanted to maintain an ashram in Calcutta, so for 20 rupees a month, he rented from Abai 4 rooms on the second floor of number 7 above Abai's chemical laboratory. 20 rupees a month. Pretty good. Now, whenever they came to Calcutta, Sridhar Maharaj, Puri Maharaj, and Bhaktisaranga Maharaj based themselves there, staying in small separate rooms. It became a regular ashram for sannyasis and brahmacharis, and Sridhar Maharaj put a sign out front, Devananda Saraswati Math. Sridhar Maharaj's establishment of a math in Mayapur with a branch in Calcutta was his response to the Gaudiya Math's split. Like other sannyasis, he had been initiating disciples in preaching, not waiting for the outcome of the litigation with its continued appeals and counterclaims. Abai was glad to encourage Sridhar Maharaj and the others who joined him at his little ashram. Here Abai and Sridhar Maharaj and his followers could remain aloof from the warring factions and together pursue their plans for spreading Krishna consciousness. The sannyasis cooked in their separate kitchen, performed their puja, and held morning and evening kirtans and lectures. Abai remained with his family, taking his own meals and performing his own puja, but he often went to discuss Srimad Bhagavatam with Sridhar Maharaj. From his roof, Abai could see the towering steeple of his spiritual master's building, the Gaudiya Math of Bagh Bazar, its ownership now contested by bitter factions. Abai would often accompany Sridhar Maharaj and his assistants at preaching programs where he would play the mridanga. And when Sridhar Maharaj fell ill, Abai led the other devotees on preaching engagements, performing kirtan, playing mridanga, and giving lectures on the Bhagavatam. Sridhar Maharaj: we did not see Abai as working very hard for making money, nor did he seem very rich or have a lot of liquid funds. He was attracted more to the spiritual side of affairs than to his family affairs. He never discussed business prospects with me, whether the business was up or down, or whether he was planning to do this or that. Monetarily, he did not have sufficient funds for giving any to the mission. Abai began to think seriously about writing Vaishnava literature. His spiritual master had seemed very pleased and had told the editor of the Harmonist, whatever he writes, publish it. Business profits, if he could somehow expand them, could go for printing books in English, as his spiritual master has said. If you ever get money, print books. Certainly, the Gaudiya Math was not going to do it. Kunja Bihari had sold Bhaktisiddhanta's printing presses to offset his legal expenses. No, Abai would have to continue on his own, maintaining his business and simultaneously trying to write and publish. And that was also the prescription of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta. Quote, it is better that he is living outside your company. When the time comes, he will do everything himself. Srila Prabhupada ki. It was 1939 that Abai wrote Introduction to Gita-upanishad. It was a short piece, but it signaled his intention to take on the task of one day translating Bhagavad Gita into English with commentary. Of course, there were already many commentaries in English, but most of them had been written by impersonalists or others who had not delivered the original spirit of the Gita, the spirit of Arjuna on the battlefield of Kurukshetra, hearing Bhagavad Gita directly from Lord Krishna. Abai knew, however, that he could present Bhagavad Gita in the proper spirit by writing an English commentary based on the teachings of Lord Chaitanya and the disciplic succession. So he began. Whenever he could make time, he would write. Although a strict grammarian could find fault in his English composition, his meaning was always clear. In his introduction, Abai reflected on the time when, as a young schoolboy, he had attended a lecture, Vidyaratna, the jewel of education. The theme of the lecture had been that God does not exist and could not exist. If there were God, he would certainly have appeared on earth to put an end to all religious rivalry. But since God had not obliged man in this way, we should banish all thought of his existence from our minds. The audience, Abai explained, consisting only of so many young boys, did not delve deeply into the subject matter of the lecture. Yet the majority, impressed by the arguments, carried away lofty ideas of godlessness and thus became agnostics at home. Abai had not been satisfied with the agnostic conclusion because I had been trained by my father to be engaged in the worship of Sri Sri Radha Govinda. But as a result of the Vidyaratna lecture, I was experiencing some mental conflict between agnosticism and the existence of Godhead. Later, having heard from his spiritual master, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta, Abai understood that the personality of Godhead exists in every sphere of activity, but we do not have the eyes to see him. Abai wrote, even if the Lord personally manifests himself on earth, the quarreling mundaners will not stop their fighting and look upon Godhead or his representative due to ignorance. This is the birthright of the individual soul by the grace of God. Bhagavad Gita is the true jewel of education. And in the Gita, Lord Krishna declares to the fighting people on earth, "Here I am, do not quarrel." The agnostic who had spoken of the jewel of education had been blinded by the jewel and therefore could not see and appreciate the personality of Godhead. Thus, he had gone on to convince others to become so-called jewels also. Following his spiritual master, Abai displayed an aggressive spirit for confronting all opponents of pure theism. In responding to his spiritual master's order to develop into an English preacher, Abai was not simply making neutral, scholarly presentations. He was willing and ready to fight, whether against modern agnostics or Vaishnavism's old traditional enemy, Mayavad impersonalism. In the last chapter, the people were so disturbed by Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati's preaching that they confronted some police magistrate, offered him 25,000 rupees, that we're going to do something, that you don't react to it. But he understood that, yes, we do these things, but not for saintly people. So he told Srila Bhaktisiddhanta, you be careful. These people are so disturbed that they want to kill you. That's the nature. They killed Lord Jesus Christ. Well, not killed, but they crucified, and they beat Haridas Thakur. So naturally, when one takes up in a bold fashion Krishna consciousness, so many enemies somehow appear, those who are propagating impersonalism, atheism. Although few scholars taught the way of surrender to Lord Krishna as espoused in Bhagavad Gita, almost all respected Bhagavad Gita as presenting the essence of all knowledge. The Gita, therefore, was the perfect vehicle for confronting those who misrepresented God in religion. The Gita was a challenge to the agnostics, apotheists, anthropomorphists, impersonalists, henotheists, pantheists, and absolute monists. Although there were already more than 600 commentaries on Bhagavad Gita that had been written by persons with an inner hatred for the personality of Godhead, and therefore they were imperfect. Such envious persons, Abai wrote, have no entrance into the real meaning of Bhagavad Gita, inasmuch as a fly cannot enter into the covered jar of honey. Abai described Indian culture as an almost impassable ocean due to its depth of thought and apparent mixtures of conclusions. But in this book, Abai declared, I will establish that Krishna is the absolute personality of Godhead by referring to the available records of scriptures, which are the recorded history of Indian culture and thought. If we didn't have the light of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta and Srila Prabhupada to bring to the forefront with illumination the true meaning of Bhagavad Gita and the true purpose of life, we would be simply bewildered by all the philosophers, atheists, agnostics, and those who are simply motivatedly giving some explanation, personal explanations without clear understanding of the absolute truth. The sannyasis at 7 Banerjee Lane were impressed by the scope of Abai's thought and intentions, as it was customary to award a title to an especially worthy Vaishnava according to his qualities. Bhakti Saranga Goswami wanted to confer upon Abai the title Bhaktisiddhanta. Sridhar Maharaj, however, thought it inappropriate to give Abai the same title as their spiritual master, and he asked that Abai's title be changed to Bhakti Vedanta. Bhakti means devotion, and Vedanta meaning the end of knowledge. Abai was grateful. The title combined the devotion of religion with the scholarship of the most rigorous philosophy as passed down by the scholarly followers of Lord Chaitanya. He appreciated the sincere gesture of his godbrothers and accepted the title as a further commitment to his spiritual path of preaching Krishna consciousness. Abai continued regularly associating with Sridhar Maharaj and discussing with him Srimad Bhagavatam. Abai encouraged him to preach widely, although Sridhar Maharaj was admittedly more the scholar and rather shy about going out and preaching. On several occasions, Abai tried to convince Sridhar Maharaj to go with him and charge Gandhi and Nehru as to why they weren't following the principles of Bhagavad Gita. Another fruit of the spiritual association at 7 Banerjee Lane was a book called Prapana Jivanamrit, compiled by Sridhar Maharaj, a collection of verses from various Vaishnava scriptures, including excerpts from the works of Rupa Goswami. It was divided into 6 chapters according to the 6 divisions of surrender. Abai, along with the sannyasis of the Devananda Saraswati Math, financed the publication. Thus it was published as a joint effort by friends. September 3rd, 1939. Lord Linnet-Glow, Viceroy of India, announced that India was at war with Germany. Thus England swept India into the war without consulting any Indians. Although independence-minded, India certainly resented such a show of foreign control. There were mixed feelings about the war. India wanted independence, yet she sympathized with the Allied cause against fascism in the West and feared an invasion by Imperial Japan in the East. Since you dislike the British so violently, one author asked a typical New Delhi student of the day, would you want Japan to invade and conquer India? Student, no, but we Indians pray that God may give the British enough strength to stand up under the blows they deserve. Although at the outbreak of the war, India had only 175,000 men in her armed forces, the British managed to increase the number of Indian soldiers to 2 million. There was no draft, but the British sent recruiting agents all over India, especially in Punjab, where military service seemed an attractive offer to the local poor. The Punjabis proved good fighters, whereas Bengalis enlisted as officers, doctors, contractors, and clerks. Indian soldiers were dispatched to battlefields in Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Persia, Malaya, Burma, and Assam. While the British were attempting to mobilize Indians for the war, the Indian nationalist movement, which had continued off and on for more than 20 years, became very active. Members of the Congress Party refused to cooperate with the war effort and demanded guaranteed independence for India. Some thought that since England had her hands full with Germany, the time was ripe to revolt and gain independence by force. Gandhi's position had been one of unconditional pacifism, and he had opposed the idea of Indians taking up arms, even to defend India. But by 1942, he had become more inimical and had reduced his policy towards the British to a simple, unequivocal, quit India. Thousands of Indians responded by chanting slogans in the street and even by tearing up the railway lines. Abai's militant former schoolmate, Subhash Chandra Bose, fought against the British in his own way. He had approached Hitler in Germany and gotten him to agree that when the Germans captured Indian soldiers, Germany would return them to Bose, who would maintain them in his nationalist army. With this army, Bose planned to return to India and drive the British from Indian soil. But dissatisfied with his progress in Germany, Bose made a similar agreement with Tojo in Japan, and soon thousands of Gurkhas and Sikhs, the best fighters in the Indian army, had defected from the British army to join Bose's freedom fighters in Singapore. Bose began to prepare his army to invade India from the north. Then, in 1943, the British found that the Japanese, who had already taken Burma, were at the doors of India, approaching Bengal by their tactic known as the denial policy. The British sank many Indian boats carrying food, destroyed large rice crops, fearing that they would fall into the hands of the enemy. This left local Indians starving and without the boats they needed for trade. The famine that ensued was the worst that had hit Bengal in 150 years. The government removed all control of food costs, and those who could not afford to buy at the skyrocketing prices died in the streets of Calcutta. Srila Prabhupada. I've got experience. The government created artificial famine. The war was going on, so Mr. Churchill's policy was to keep the people in scarcity so they will volunteer to become soldiers. So this policy was executed. Big men, they collected the rice. Rice was selling at 6 rupees per mound. All of a sudden, it came to 50 rupees per mound. I was in the grocery shop purchasing, and all of a sudden the grocer said, no, I am not going to sell anymore. At that moment, the price was 6 rupees per mound. So suddenly, he was not going to sell. A few hours later, I went back to purchase. The rice had gone up to 50 rupees per mound. The government-appointed agents began to purchase the rice and other commodities, which are daily necessities. They can offer any price because the currency is in their hands. They can print so-called papers, $100 and pay. A man becomes satisfied thinking, oh, I have $100, but it is a piece of paper. That was the policy. You have no money, no rice. So another avenue is open. Yes, you become a soldier. You get so much money. People out of poverty would go there. I have seen it. No rice was available in the market and people were hungry. They were dying. Abai managed to purchase just enough for his family to survive. But he saw the beggar population increase by the hundreds. Month after month, he saw the footpaths and open spaces congested with beggars, cooking their food on improvised stoves and sleeping in the open or beneath the trees. He saw starving children rummaging in the dustbins for a morsel of food. From there, it was but a step to fighting with the dogs for a share of the garbage, and this also became a familiar sight in Calcutta streets. The British had little time to spare from their war efforts, and they worked only to save those lives essential for the fight. For the common people, the empire's prescription was uniform and simple starvation. Srila Prabhupada, one American gentleman was present at that time. He remarked, people are starving in this way. In our country, there would have been revolution. Yes, but the people of India are so trained that in spite of artificial famine, they did not commit theft, stealing others' property. People were dying. Still, they thought, all right, God has given. That was the basic principle of Vedic civilization. Abai knew that under the laws of nature, there was no scarcity. By God's arrangement, the earth could produce enough food. The trouble was man's greed. There's no scarcity in the world, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati had said. The only scarcity is of Krishna consciousness. And this was how Abai saw 1943 famine. Now, more than ever, this spiritual vision was relevant. Krishna consciousness was the prime necessity. How else could man be checked from his evil propensities to become greedy, hoard, make war, and thus create misery for millions? He had seen the heinous activities of the British in India. They're cutting off the thumbs of the weavers so that Indian-made cotton goods could not compete with the foreign-made cloth. They're shooting down of unarmed, innocent citizens. They're creating artificial famine. They're propagating the myth that Indian civilization was primitive. Still, he did not believe that an independent Indian government would necessarily be an improvement. Unless the leadership was Krishna conscious, and neither Gandhi nor Subhash Chandra Bose was then the government would be able to provide no real solutions. Only stopgap measures. Without obedience to the laws of God, as expressed by the scriptures and sages, governments would only increase human suffering. Then Calcutta was bombed day after day. The bombing was concentrated in special areas such as the Kittapur port facility and Shama Bazaar in North Calcutta, very near to Abai's home at Sitakanta Banerjee Lane. American planes had been leaving from airfields near Calcutta for targets in China and Japan, so the air raids on Calcutta seemed an inevitable retaliation. It was the Japanese striking back. Or was it? Some said it was the forces of Subhash Chandra Bose, since the bombs fell mostly in the European quarter. But for the people of Calcutta, it made little difference who was attacking. After the first bombing, people evacuated the city. Blackouts were imposed, and at night the entire city was dark. Srila Prabhupada. The whole Calcutta became vacant. Perhaps only myself and a few others remained. I sent my sons to Navadvip. Of course, my daughter was married. My wife refused to go out of Calcutta. She said, "I'll be bombed, but I will not go." So I had to remain in Calcutta. I have seen bombing in Calcutta all night. I was just eating when there was the siren. So the arrangement was that in your house would be the shelter room. I was hungry, so I first finished eating. Then I went to the room, and the bombing began. Chee, yum. I was thinking that this was also Krishna in another form, but that form was not very lovable. In the midst of these calamities, Abai felt more than ever the need to propagate Krishna consciousness. He had something to say to the war-weary citizens of the world. He longed for a more effective forum, a publication of some kind, a way to present the world's crisis through the eyes of Scripture in the same bold style as had his spiritual master. There was no shortage of ideas, and he had been saving money from his business for this very purpose. Yet how could he dare produce such a journal when even learned sannyasis, senior disciples of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta, were not? He never considered himself a great scholar among his godbrothers, although they called him Kavi, and now Bhaktivedanta. As a grihastha, he wasn't expected to take the lead or publish his own journal. But times had changed. The English journal, The Harmonist, had not been published since before Srila Bhaktisiddhanta's passing away. Now almost a decade had passed, and the Gaudiya Math had been too busy fighting in court to consider preaching. Long gone was the tireless spirit that for 10 consecutive years had produced the daily Nadia Prakash. No longer were 4 separately located printing presses pumping out transcendental literature under the direction of Bhaktivinoda Thakur's empowered son. The presses had been sold by Kunja Bihari. Times had changed. The Gaudiya Math was only fighting while the non-devotees were killing each other in a world war. From his front room at 6 Sita Kanta Banerjee, Abai conceived, wrote, edited, and typed the manuscript for a magazine. He designed a logo, a long rectangle across the top of the page. In the front left-hand corner was a figure of Lord Chaitanya, effulgent with rays of light like rays from the sun. In the lower right were silhouettes of a crowd of people in darkness, but groping to receive light from Lord Chaitanya. And between Lord Chaitanya and the people, the title unfurled like a banner, "Back to Godhead." In the lower right corner of the picture of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, seated at his writing, looking up thoughtfully as he composed. Above the logo ran the motto, "Back to Godhead is light, nescience is darkness. Where there is Godhead, there is no nescience." Below the logo were the following lines, edited and founded under the direct order of His Divine Grace, Sri Srimad Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Goswami Prabhupada, by Mr. Abhay Charan Dey. When I was in Miami, I started book distribution in '76 in the airport. We were doing Back to Godhead magazines. So for many years, Back to Godhead was the main book or magazine that would go out. Then like in '77, '78, we introduced big book distribution as well. But the Back to Godhead magazine has always been the backbone of our society. Abai had already gained some printing experience in connection with his business, and after completing the manuscript, he brought it to Saraswati Press, the best printers in Bengal. He also hired an agent, Calcutta's prestigious booksellers, Thakur, Spink and Company, who would take responsibility for distributing the journal, to bookstores and libraries, including outlets in several foreign countries. But when he went to buy paper, he met with government restrictions. Because of the war and the subsequent paper shortage, they wanted to say that he had written in terms of the national needs during their time of world crisis. In ordinary citizens, religious newspaper was hardly top priority. Abai's request for paper was perfunctorily denied, but he persisted. He appealed that using paper to print the teachings of the personality of Godhead was not a waste and not untimely in the present troubled atmosphere. Finally, he obtained permission to print his first edition of Back to Godhead, a 44-page publication. Abai Charan greeted his readers by defining his motto, Godhead is light, nescience is darkness. When a man forgets that he is a son of Godhead and identifies himself with the body, then he's in ignorance. He's like a man who's very concerned with the automobile's mechanism, yet with no knowledge of the driver. The defect of the present day civilization is just like that. This is actually the civilization of nescience or illusion, and therefore civilization has been turned into militarization. Everyone is fully concerned with the comforts of the body and everything related with the body. No one is concerned with the spirit that moves the body, although even a boy can realize that the motor car mechanism has little value if there's no driver of the car. This dangerous ignorance of humanity is a gross nescience and has created a dangerous civilization in the form of militarization. This militarization, which is in softer language, is nationalism, is an external barrier to understanding human relations. There's no meaning in a fight where the parties do fight only for the matter of different colored dresses. There must be therefore the understanding of human relation without any consideration of the bodily designation or colored dresses. Just one more paragraph. Back to Godhead is a feeble attempt by the undersigned under the direction of His Divine Grace Srimad Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Goswami Prabhupada, the celebrated founder and organizer of the Gaudiya Math activities, just to bring up a real relation of humanity with central relation of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. That there's a great and urgent need of a literature like this is keenly felt by the leaders of all countries, and the following statements will help much in the procedure. Time is up. So we're in 126, page 126. This Lilamrita is actually very, very instructive, because we tend to sometimes think that things are done in this world by chance, that, all these things are happening by chance. But when you see the history and the confusion and the misguided people who are under the illusion, just looking for happiness and not having any real guidance or leadership. So Srila Prabhupada was sent by Lord Krishna. He's an empowered representative of the Lord to carry out the clear mission of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And by hearing of his activities, an endeavor to preach Krishna consciousness should give us also added determination and enthusiasm to help spread Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's mission through the teachings of Srila Prabhupada by the mercy of our beloved Abhay Charanaravinda Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada ki. Hare Krishna. Thank you.